Mr. Mason, tell me when you're ready, sir. Good evening. Good evening and welcome. I have called the lecture series that I've convened this summer Liberal Education in the Age of the LLM. The series mostly originates in a frustration I have with the extravagant rhetoric that surrounds talk of large language models, Chat GPT, and the like. The extravagant rhetoric, at least as I encounter it, takes one of two opposing forms: either technophilic fantasies about what human life might be when Chat GPT does all the work of human hands. Chat GPT freeing us for lives of leisure. Leisure often figured, somewhat surprisingly, as mindlessly scrolling Instagram. That's one of the forms the extravagant rhetoric takes. The other form is technophobic jeremiads about the loss of the old ways, the loss of connection, of presence, of real knowing, or of real learning in community. I would like for this lecture series to be an occasion for something far less extravagant, something far more patient and enduring, an opportunity to sit and think with and alongside one another, guided by 5 excellent lecturers about human thinking itself. I think that this is what makes this college so distinctive, the way it provides a space and occasion for thinking about thinking, or thinking about knowing, and doing so without the distractions of the extravagant rhetoric about what makes the latest iteration of some large language model special. This certainly does not mean ignoring what it is that makes such models capable of doing what it is that they do. But it does mean attempting to understand what they do from the ground up. And that, I think, is what this college is uniquely positioned to do. And I hope that this series shows why a college with the distinctive commitments it has, commitments to foundational texts, to encountering problems in the forms in which they were first posed, shows that it is exactly this college, or a college of this sort, that will allow for clarity about what it is that is happening all around us. I'm so grateful to the 5 lecturers who have come together to help us in this undertaking. 4 tutors at the college and 1 colleague, Nathaniel Chambers, from the Computer Science Department at the Naval Academy. I'm also very grateful to the Dean and Interim President of the college, Susan Pullman, for her support of the study of questions about human thought, technology, and computation, questions that she, like I, believe to be part of an education into freedom. I'd also like to thank an anonymous benefactor of the Graduate Institute whose financial and intellectual support makes undertakings like this possible. But tonight, I'm especially grateful to my colleague, Leah Lasell, longtime tutor on the Annapolis campus of St. John's College. I heard intimations of the lecture that Ms. Lasell is going to give tonight some time ago, and was struck then by just how rich Ms. Lasell was already thinking some years ago about the place of writing in a liberal education in this contemporary moment. a place that has only grown more mysterious and difficult to articulate with each day. And so I'm delighted to welcome Ms. Leah Lasell to the podium to begin this series, and more importantly, to learn with and from her in her lecture titled The Poet and the City. Leah Lasell.
Brendan promises that we will not be Jeremiads up here, but as he was describing the Jeremiad, I thought, uh-oh, I should have had that ahead of time. But I'll try my best to give a more balanced perspective. So I'll begin with a caveat. I am not an expert on large language models. Nonetheless, tonight, with some trepidation, I will attempt to explain the small part that I understand of how LLMs work. I do this because a modestly improved understanding of how they work will help us more intelligently address how they might affect higher education. If you think that I've said anything misleading, or if you simply have more to add to this sketch, I would love to hear from you in the question period. The most lucid presentations of this material that I have found, and on which my own understanding mostly rests, are the visual presentations and lectures that the mathematician and computer scientist Grant Sanderson has created. I am also heavily indebted to Fei-Fei Li's book, The Worlds I See. After giving a rough overview of how LLMs work, large language models work, we will turn to look at the handout, which you should all have. The handout includes 5 opening paragraphs written in response to the prompt, "Write a paper on Telemachus." At least one of the paragraphs is an output from ChatGPT. The rest were written by students in a freshman language tutorial more than a decade ago. After giving an introduction to LLMs, I thought we might do something a bit untraditional. I'll open the floor for you to make observations and guesses about the authorship of these paragraphs. I'm interested to hear whether you can tell the differences between a passage written by a human and an output of a large language model. After looking at these examples together, I'll turn to 2 questions that we might keep in mind over the next few years as we are bombarded with both the promises and the threats that artificial intelligence in all its forms will bring to higher education. The 2 questions are very simple. Why do we write? And why do we read? I have found it helpful to repeat these questions to myself as I learn about LLMs. My answers to these questions have managed to be helpful guides, even though my answers to them have changed as I've learned more about artificial intelligence. Like compasses, which never seem to work for me, these questions remind me that I need to be mindful of what direction I'm walking in, even if I'm unsure where we will end up. Because my answers to these questions have changed and developed as I've learned about large language models, I imagine yours might as well. It might be worth formulating for yourself now preliminary answers to both. Why do we write? Why do we read? I've chosen an unlikely wingman for this talk, Wystan Auden and his essay, The Poet and the City. Although he knows nothing about large language models, he wrote the essay in the 1960s, he does write about how technology has changed the relationship of the poet to his city. I found that his essay provoked me into thinking about some of the more radical possible consequences of LLMs on who we are as both writers and readers. Okay, here goes. Here's a rough overview before we get into more details. Large language models are a form of narrow or weak artificial intelligence that takes an input, a string of words, and then uses a probability model to predict and thereby to generate one more word. I think this is something that I didn't really realize. It then takes the new string, which is the original string plus that one additional word, and puts it into the model again, generating one more word. It then iterates this process to produce a larger output. The final output, which looks to us like sentences in English, is produced word by simple probabilities. LLMs are widely agreed to be narrow or weak artificial intelligence for a few reasons. The programs are designed with only one task in mind. The programs cannot readily be said to understand or reason about the symbols that they employ. And the programs cannot teach themselves to do new tasks. This weak AI is often contrasted with strong artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence. LLMs are said to be generative. What makes it generative, as compared to, say, a vending machine, is that the program generates something that you, the user, could not have determined ahead of time. What makes these programs generative in an interesting way is that while you might not have been able to determine it, the output makes sense because it looks like something a person might have said next as well. So how do LLMs generate the next word? To begin with, we might be a bit more precise. The LLM doesn't actually create a word, but a token. And each token carries a consistent meaning, more or less a consistent meaning in English. For example, the token might be the whole word the, but it also might be a part of a word like ish. Each token in the English language, and then some symbols besides, is assigned a vector. These vectors encode meaning. I think this is, for me, surprisingly appealing. Some of you might hate that words can be turned into vectors, but I actually love it. You might imagine a token like girl and boy as having similar vectors that point in about the same direction. We might also imagine the token for woman and man would have similar vectors, but again, not quite the same. Because these vectors are not words, we can do mathematical operations upon them like addition, adding the meanings together, or subtraction to find the differences in meaning. The vector difference between the vectors for girl and boy, for example, is probably similar to the vector difference between woman and man. If we subtract the vectors for boy from girl and add that vector to the vector for man, we will probably get the vector for a woman. Yeah. A favorite example that I've heard is the following. If you take Germany and you subtract Japan and add this vector to sushi, you get a bratwurst. Given the complexity of human language, it is not surprising that these vectors cannot be captured in three-dimensional space. But I was surprised to learn that each token has more than 12,000 dimensions. So each token in our language is thus mapped to a vector in a 12,000, it's actually more than 12,000 dimensional space. A problem quickly arises. It is often the case in English that the same string of letters can have vastly different meanings. The vector for can, for example, has to encode both the possibility of the word can in the sentence, he can climb Mount Everest, and the word can in the sentence, he kicked the can down the street. The vectors for some words won't be able to encode their meanings. Instead, these vectors are something like averages over all the possible meanings. The vectors associated with these tokens will point to a position in our meaning space that doesn't correspond to their meaning in any actual word, much less the word in the particular sentence. The vector for can, for example, might be might not be next to the vector for canister, which we might expect, nor will it be next to able. Instead, it could very well show up close to something rather odd, like corpse. The LLM needs a way to pay attention to the context of the sentence and tweak this vector so that it can take on a direction in the meaning space that corresponds to that particular token's meaning in that particular sentence. The transformer, the T in GPT, in like ChatGPT, is what allows a model to do this. A transformer allows the program to pay attention to a set of words in a given context and let those words change the vectors associated with each word. The transformer allows for the program to pay attention in just the way needed to the context available in the surrounding text and also the position of the word in the sentence. This may not be true for other languages, but in English, the position will change the meaning. So if the word can occurs in a sentence, the vector that is associated with the word will be transformed based both on its order and the other words in the sentence. With the updated vectors for each of the words, the paper, just a side mention, the paper for transformers was generated by researchers at Google in 2017. Up to this point, artificial intelligence for these large language models just wasn't working very well. So this was like a huge paper. It's one of the top 10 most cited papers. I think it's called Attention is All We Need. With the updated vectors for each of the words, the program can use these in a better way to predict the next token. Okay, that's about the limit of my knowledge on LLMs. I'm still learning. There's parts at the end that I don't understand. If you do, I would love to hear about them. A few years ago, I was asked to give a report to the visiting committee of our college's board on large language models. The tutors, deans, administrators, and board members were justifiably concerned. In this report, I focused on the practical consequences of students' access to a program that, to many, appears to be able to write student papers. As part of this report, I put together a handout that is largely like the one in front of you. The handout included 5 opening paragraphs written in response to the prompt, write a paper on Telemachus. At least one of the outputs was from ChatGPT. The rest were written by students in a freshman language tutorial more than a decade ago, so I'm certain they weren't produced by artificial intelligence. Today's handout is largely the same, but I've replaced any outputs by the old version of ChatGPT with the updated model. So I don't know how people will respond to this. I don't know whether you'll be able to still distinguish the student writing from the outputs from ChatGPT. A few years ago, though, I did create an anonymous online survey for my colleagues, asking them to try to identify who was the author of these passages. The results were very surprising. Of the 12 faculty members that took the survey, 9 members correctly identified the author of every single passage. 2 faculty members only misattributed 1 paragraph. 1 faculty member, I can't help but mention from Santa Fe, correctly identified only 2 of the examples. This last faculty member told me about their bad results. They had also told me before taking the quiz that they were sure it would be impossible to identify the AI-written work, and the results, they told me triumphantly, confirmed their suspicions. They were quite dismayed to learn that the average score for the other 11 faculty members was a 96%. Would faculty know when they received a paper written by AI? The answer was, for the most part, yes. I'm eager to find out, when we look at the handouts together in a few minutes, whether we will be equally successful with the updated model. The purpose of the handout and the original presentation was practical, but the question of whether one can distinguish between the outputs of a large language model and human writing is also an important theoretical question. Alan Turing suggested in his 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, that we replace the question and answer to, can machines think, with an imitation game and the results from this game. In the imitation game, a man and a machine, appropriately screened from the view of an interrogator, respond to questions. If the interrogator can't distinguish between man and machine, and there are some subtleties here, then the machine can be said to think. If we aren't able to distinguish between paragraphs produced by the model and a human, then maybe we should attribute the ability to write and speak to the large language model. Kind of curious whether your intuitions on that are the same as Turing's. Many people reject the idea that the Turing test would determine whether or not a program is thinking. These people reject the idea that the ability to seem intelligent is the same as being intelligent. John Searle, in his 1980 paper, Minds, Brains, and Programs, gives a devastating critique of Turing's test for intelligence that centers on the impossibility of a computer program pointing or intending. He says Turing has confused the simulation of thinking with duplication. He says that the Turing test is unashamedly behavioristic and operationalistic. Even if a program's output is indistinguishable from the responses of a human, the program's output lacks meaning until a human reader gives it meaning. Here we might think back to the vector space for meaning. Would we think that that vector really has meaning, or that its meaning only comes when a human interprets that vector? Before the human reader imbues it with life, the output is senseless, not even arising to the level of symbols, because the program is not causally connected to the world in the right way to intend. The computer program simulates language, but it's not language because it is not intentional. I find Searle's critique of Turing persuasive, at least for the most part. Even if we were unable to distinguish between computer-generated writing and a student's essay, that doesn't mean the computer is doing the same thing as the student. The student, even a student who writes awkwardly or ungrammatically, is doing something a machine, I think, could never do. Okay, so this is the untraditional part. I would love to hear what you think of the handouts, or of the paragraphs in the handout, and whether anyone is willing to venture a guess and some thoughts about what we're looking at. Go for it.
One caught my eye when it says this conflict can be most clearly seen most clearly throughout his 8 short speeches. 8 short speeches is impressive. Either we have a student who has way too much time on their hands to diagram the Odyssey, or some scholar somewhere counted the speeches, wrote it online, ChatGPT read it, and then said it.
Okay, so we have a, yeah, go for it.
I guess I actually had the opposite impression. That saying something like seems to struggle deeply with the identity of not only himself, instead of his own identity, is a mistake that I think a student is liable to make often. Just the sort of grammatical crunchiness there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think number 2 could be AI generated just because, like at a glance, it's the only one where the title of the text is italicized. It also has no, but it also has no, like, I don't know, it feels sanitized to me. I couldn't think of a
Sanitized, okay.
specific sentence, but it has that kind of soulless feeling of ChatGPT. I don't see the clunkiness that was pointed to a moment ago.
Yeah, okay.
I think 1 or 2 definitely stand out as the most likely to be ChatGPT, but I also think there's a possibility they're all ChatGPTs. Well, because they seem too consistent. Like, if these are all meant to be like different students, they all seem to have a very
Oh, yeah. Mr. Caswell said that he liked number 4 because it was the only one that seemed like a narrative. And what was the last part?
It seemed like a one-line responding to something you read, as opposed to something that could have been collected from a lot of different.
Also had that alternate spelling that seemed like a choice.
Yeah.
How did you choose the examples from students?
They were the ones, so,
They were the ones that looked the most like chat.
no, they weren't. They were the ones that I had in my email 10 years later. I wrote this, right? Some students turned it in by hand, and some students turned it in by email. And there are, in fact, student writing here. There is, in fact, student writing here.
But you're admitting that not all of these were written by ChatGPT.
I am admitting that, yes. There are definitely, there's student, I tried to be ambiguous about how many of each there were, but
We're just getting really pretentious as well. I noticed a few different silly mistakes, like there was self-inflicted as self-space inflicted, which is not a mistake. Yeah, it makes it fine. It looks like student as well, because it would consider self-inflicted either as a single thing or if it's your token thing you're saying.
so one of the things I've been noticing is that some people look for mistakes and then attribute it to a human being, and some people look for intelligence and then attribute it to a human being. It's interesting to try to figure out how those two things go together.
Well, I think number 5 has to be real because it cites numbers, and I don't think ChatGPT would just do that for fun.
Because it, what?
It has page numbers.
It has a citation, yeah.
So I will say one of my giveaways at recognizing student ChatGPT is the use of the word evident. So that makes me always suspicious. In number 5.
That 1 and 5 are both good candidates, but they seem kind of
Good candidates for a student or
good candidates for
the machine? Okay.
ChatGPTs.
1 and 5.
They seem so clinical, so kind of coldly analytical,
Yeah.
matter of fact.
2 likes sets of 3.
Two,
Likes listing 3 things. But
is that a human or a machine?
since this was written by freshmen, they may have become accustomed to doing this in high school, so it's hard to say.
Although Mom and Williamson likes using 3 too.
My question, and maybe somebody here knows the answer, is whether the quote in number 5 is real. Because I know that ChatGPT is very good at imitating things. It could imitate a quote from the Odyssey if it thought that a paper about the Odyssey needed to cite it. I don't know. I don't know if it's real or not, but maybe somebody else will.
How many of you are familiar with the idea of hallucinations? Yeah, so artificial intelligence, these large language models often hallucinate. I assume that's what you're referring to. They'll make something look like it was a quote, but the machine will just be making it up. Because again, it's predicting the next word. It's not reading a string, right? So if it's just predicting the next word, who knows what it'll come up with?
Can you tell us what your prompt to the AI was?
I did write it down. I don't want to misspeak, but I think it was write a paper on Telemachus. It was. I try to be very open with my students. I try to let them take as much authority over the matters they can. No, it was well, for the ChatGPT, it was write a paragraph. But for the students, they wrote an entire paper. I thought somebody's observation seems right to me, that these look a lot like ChatGPT. Even the student writing does. And I think that's because it's a first paragraph. I think tutors probably have the experience of whenever I have freshmen, it feels like I spend the whole year just going with my red pen through the first paragraphs of student papers. And it's because they sound like this. They're kind of awkward.
So the prompt wasn't to write a paper like a St. John's freshman.
No. No, it was not that. Mm-hmm.
You can find papers online
I can.
and pull them together.
Kind of averages them out.
Averages them out,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, very much. Okay, I think so far we're doing pretty badly. Go ahead.
And there are also a lot of pairs, so like whether he speaks well or poorly, and then what sort of man he has been, what sort he will become. That seems like the probability, right, you have one half of a pair to give the other half. And it's just repetitive throughout the whole thing, so I would guess that one. Yeah, I agree with 3. And also the way it's written, like somehow the transitions feel off. It does kind of feel like it's like the iPhone suggesting the next word.
Mm-hmm.
The way the sentences come, I want to put another like. I mean, yeah, either it's like a really bad writer, or yeah, I agree with the 3.
One thing I noticed in 1 and 3 is the proper use of apostrophe after Telemachus. Very often attempt to write how we speak, so we would say Telemachus's woe or Telemachus's words, but this has it properly written according to like English rules.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at one point, it varied, depending on whether it was an ancient name or an ancient S, and whether it was a more modern name like Descartes, ending in S. So that Descartes would be Descartes, apostrophe S, whereas Telemachus, or Jesus would be just apostrophe. Now,
I'm not sure what to anticipate there for the human or the bot. Okay. We're gonna just do a show of hands. All will be revealed in the question period. But for right now, I'm just gonna leave you hanging. So for the first sample, raise your hand if you think it was written by a student. By a student for number 1. Okay, it looks, I'd say maybe like 75% of you. Okay, I should write this down. Okay, I got a little pencil here. We're ready. I'm gonna grade you guys. This is fun. Number 2, written by a human. I'd say maybe 10%. Yeah, that sounds about right to me. Number 3, written by a human. Feels like we have like this side says yes, this side says no. In quadrants or something, that back quadrant's like no. Okay, I'd say 50%. Okay, number 4, written by a human. Okay, interesting. I'd say 90%. Okay, and number 5, written by a human. Yeah, close to 70%. Okay, interesting. Okay, so the 2 questions that I wanted to consider are why do we write and why do we read? We'll start with why do we write? If your answer is because we have to, then large language models might seem like a very fine invention. Because many of us have to write for our jobs and find this writing challenging and time-consuming, we might be hopeful that we might turn to these machines to do at least some of our work for us. On the other hand, we realize that we are employed because we have a job to do, and that the very machines that might help us do these jobs might simply take the jobs away from us. Within colleges and universities, the invention of large language models will affect students, faculty, administrators, and board members, all of whom have to write a great deal. Students need to write papers in order to pass the classes they need for their credentials. Faculty need to write books in order to get the tenure that will secure their jobs. And administrators must write memos, emails, reports, websites, admissions materials, press releases, and a lot more. Even board members must write, presenting reports to show how they are fulfilling their job as overseers. A lot of writing has to get done. All of us could, theoretically, turn to large language models to make our work easier. If it isn't happening already, then within a year or two, I think people throughout most universities will be using them in some way. Even now, I suspect faculty, though not here, administrators and board members are dabbling. There's a lot of hand-wringing about whether the students, too, might turn to the large language models. The worry, in part, is that if students turn to the models to write papers, then it could undermine a central part of the mission of most, if not all, institutions of higher education, teaching students how to write. Of course, if students will no longer need to write, then the mission of the university will be undermined, not from the inside, but from the outside. And thinking about writing is something that must be done. I think colleges and universities will find themselves in a web of contradictions. On the one hand, the faculty will be forcing students to write, and in a state of constant suspicion, trying to determine whether or not the students are doing what they have to do. On the other hand, the very same faculty, feeling their own pressures of publication, will be making use of any reasonable shortcuts that the large language models might offer them to get to publication deadlines faster. But what if we back up and revisit our question? Why do we write? Auden reports at the opening of his address to a room full of Mount Holyoke students that an astonishing number of young people, when asked what they want to do in life, say, "I want to be a writer." Young people, far from being forced to be writers, would choose it over many other careers. Young people recognize, Auden writes, that practically all workers have been reduced to laborers, and that labor as such is slavery. Writing, far from being the very thing that we are all forced to do, and the very thing that we are going to turn to large language models to help us avoid, might be something that we want to do. What if the answer to the question, why do we write, is because we want to, because it makes us free? I had a longer section here. Auden can be very political, and I decided to delete it and just leave it as a question for you guys. I think I've found it very helpful. One of the reasons why I love this essay is just this fact that students want to write, and sort of dwelling on that fact has changed the way I think about writing in the classroom. It changes the way I assign papers, it changes the way I read papers, it actually changes the type of papers I do assign, and I found that very helpful. And just the question itself, why do we write? And the fact that we might want to write by itself alone, I think can be a very powerful thing to have. So I'll just stop there. Why do we read? Before I turn to the second question, why do we read, I will spend a few minutes on a preliminary observation. There are a lot of books in the world. As I stroll down the shelves of our own Greenfield library, each book, standing straight upon the shelf, wedged in with all the others, seems to say, I am here in order to be read. I deserve to be read. Please read me. The books themselves seem to be asking us a question. What are you going to do with all of us? In answer, I would like to read a few paragraphs from Virginia Woolf's waggish satire, A Society, in which our narrator introduces us to a young woman named Pole. A group of young women are gathered around the fire drinking when Pole bursts into tears. Pole, I must tell you, has always been queer. For one thing, her father was a strange man. He left her a fortune in his will, but on condition that she read all the books in the London Library. We comforted her as best we could, but we knew in our hearts how vain it was. For though we liked her, Pole is no beauty. She leaves her shoelaces untied, and must have been thinking, while we praised men, that not one of them would ever wish to marry her. At last she dried her tears. For some time we could make nothing of what she said. She told us that, as we knew, she spent most of her time in the London Library, reading. She had begun, she said, with English literature on the top floor, and was steadily working her way down to the Times on the bottom. And now half, or perhaps only a quarter, way through, a terrible thing had happened. She could read no more. Books were not what we thought them. Books, she cried, rising to her feet and speaking with an intensity of desolation which I shall never forget, are for the most part unutterably bad. Of course, we cried out, that Shakespeare wrote books, and Milton, and Shelley. Oh yes, she interrupted us. You've been well taught, I can see. But you are not members of the London Library. Here her sobs broke forth anew. At length, recovering a little, she opened one of the pile of books which she always carried about with her. From a window, or in a garden, or some such name as that it was called. And it was written by a name called Benton, or Henson, or something of that kind. She read the first few pages. We listened in silence. But that's not a book, someone said. So she chose another. This time it was a history, but I have forgotten the writer's name. Our trepidation increased as she went on. Not a word of it seemed true, and the style in which it was written was execrable. Poetry, poetry, we cried impatiently. Read us poetry. I cannot describe the desolation which fell upon us as she opened a little volume and mouthed out the verbose, sentimental foolery which it contained. It must have been written by a woman. But no, she told us that it was written by a young man, one of the most famous poets of the day. I leave you to imagine what the shock of the discovery was. Though we all cried and begged her to read no more, she persisted and read us extracts from the lives of the Lord Chancellors. When she had finished, Jane, the eldest and wisest of us, rose to her feet and said that she, for one, was not convinced. Why, she asked, if men write such rubbish as this, should our mothers have wasted their youth in bringing them into the world? We were all silent, and in the silence, poor Pole could be heard sobbing out, why did my father teach me to read? Wolfe's story is just imaginable enough. We can imagine a curmudgeonly, eccentric, scholarly father that would have left his estate to his daughter under the single condition that she read the entirety of the London Library. What is not imaginable is that a father would ever ask his daughter to read the internet. But while a father would never ask his daughter to do so, the internet itself might. We've probably all had experiences something like this. Late at night, as you sit on your couch, so tired that you are too tired to go to bed, the internet, a bit like the books on the shelves, seems to whisper, you should watch me. You should read me. Just one more click, just one more page. Like the books in the library, the internet can sometimes seem to impose a demand on all of us. You've created me. Now you better make use of me. The creators of large language models have some answers to this demand. To best understand the answers, we need to know a little bit more about them. While the 20th century was replete with researchers who were working on programs to design artificial intelligence, the progress was very slow. In part, it was slow because programmers were trying to figure out a way to encode human intelligence and reasoning. One way to think about it is they were trying to make the program itself really sophisticated as a mind. This, as you can imagine, is really hard. In the first decade of the 20th century, a computer scientist named Fei-Fei Li decided to approach the problem from the other end. Rather than trying to encode the intelligence which understands the world, she would try to encode the world for the intelligence. This is what led her to create one of the first large data sets. It's called ImageNet. She invited scientists to use this data set to test their programs. The creation of this large data set was an enormous task. You can read about it online. It's really incredible how much work it took. And the possibility of a good outcome was merely conjecture. Many of her colleagues were quite skeptical. ImageNet debuted in 2009, and as many suspected, it was a bit of a flop. She created a contest in 2010 so that other programmers could test out their algorithms on the data set to see which images would be correctly labeled. She thought maybe the contest would stir up excitement. Again, tepid responses. But after a couple of years, there was an entry in 2012 with a program called AlexNet. AlexNet was a neural network. Neural networks have been around since the 1940s. Some actually attributed them to like Gauss, even further back. But they were called neural nets in the 1940s. But they'd largely been discarded. But AlexNet won the contest by a significant margin. The fact that a neural network had won was attention-grabbing. The neural networks, which had largely been considered a defunct branch of research, were revived. Li and others realized that large advances might be made with better models, better neural networks, and on the other side, huge data sets. What is the internet good for? Li's contest made it clear that data sets might be what would make basic neural networks intelligent, because intelligence might not be created from programming reasoning, but from training a fairly basic neural network on lots and lots of data. I think this too is just sort of philosophically interesting to think of the mind as being created by the world, but not that sophisticated in and of itself. The internet provides an enormous pool from which to create data sets to help train artificial neural networks, thereby creating artificial intelligence. As the LLMs have been trained on larger and larger data sets, their ability to create human-sounding language has grown. As this has happened, the promise of these large language models has gone from being primarily a research interest about the possibility of artificial intelligence into a commercial one about the possibilities for artificial intelligence. LLMs are now good enough at simulating speech that they look like they could take over for our beleaguered pole. Now those with money see a different possibility for all that data on the internet. The answer isn't simply to use all the data on the internet to create intelligence. That was a research theoretical enterprise. It's to use all the data on the internet to create intelligence, then use this intelligence to create outputs that people will pay for. Let's turn back to our question, why do we read? One might answer, we read in order to learn. I think that seems like a pretty good answer. Could large language models help us read so that we could learn more? If so, should we embrace them? As we have already seen, large language models are not yet great writers. I was hoping you would see that. I think you mostly did, but it wasn't as obvious as I had hoped. And their ability to read will do us no good if they aren't able to write about what they have read accurately. That is, if these large language models continue to hallucinate. But we can imagine that someday, not too long from now, a more sophisticated model will be created that could do this well. One day soon, all the books in the library could be replaced by a chatbot that can tell each of us, as we need to know, or as we care to know, what the books say. The chatbot will produce a custom output of the length we require, enriched by all the books in the entire library for each inquiry that we bring to it. When we are done with this output, it would disappear from the world, although the machine would always be ready to reproduce it for when we needed it next. This super LLM would be like a reading assistant, helping us to read more, faster, and better. In this hypothetical scenario, with the super LLM, I'd like to imagine that human beings themselves continue to learn about the world and write books about it. In fact, the outputs from the super LLM help them learn the necessary material and do all the relevant research faster than we can do it now. Once a person finishes writing a book, it is digitized and given to the super LLM. Other humans could read it, but it would be generally considered better to just feed it to the LLM so that it can be synthesized with what other humans have learned and written about. I'm forced to acknowledge that a super LLM like this would make it easier to learn. As an example, while working through manual notes on Max Planck's 8 lectures on theoretical physics this fall, I could have used a bespoke book that rewrote these lectures with simplified explanations of the preliminary work on which it is based. Each of my students could also have used their own book, written for their specific level of understanding of the preceding material and the level of mathematics that they were comfortable with. In our prompts of a super LLM, we could ask it to produce a book for each of us that would help us understand Planck's lectures and would help us do it in a minimum of time, make our learning enjoyable, and make our learning enjoyable. After each receiving our outputs and reading them, we could come together and have a class discussion. Would we learn more? Would it be more pleasurable? Would it be better? Now I imagine the evening seminar. Let's suppose it is on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Here too, the super LLM promises riches. Rather than simply reading a very small 20-page segment of Hegel's work, which is all we can get through in the original in a single night, the super LLM would be able to create an output that would cover half of the book. The LLM might simplify the prose, unify the argument, and get the whole point out across more clearly while still including the best passages from the original. Again, the LLM could produce an output designed for each student in the class, highlighting those themes that each of us would find most worthwhile. Would we learn more this way? Would it be more pleasurable? Would it be better? I'm a bit horrified by this whole thought experiment. While in any given instance, I can see some advantage, the thought that this is what we will all soon be doing makes me think of intellectual worker bees in a giant hive. If the answer to the question, why do we read, is simply to gain knowledge, then the answer doesn't seem to me robust enough to explain why this hive mind is unattractive. We need to add something more to explain why this use of large language models would be unappealing. In Auden's essay, he talks about a change that has already begun to take place with the production of art. Art, Auden writes, has fundamentally changed in the modern era. Art used to be created to last, but the possibilities of mass production and the possibilities of making money from this mass production destroys the long-lasting character of art. The audience for popular art is the majority, and this audience, the mass media, must steal from the artist in order to make money. We can work through a particular example of this by considering what has happened since the Grimm brothers wrote their fairy tales in 1812. In the first edition, there were 86 stories. In the second edition, 156. And in the seventh and final edition, more than 200 tales. The brothers, in order to make money, or in order for their publishers to make money, had to print more and more tales with each edition. This same pressure for more and more is present not just for books, but in other mediums as well. Netflix, right? Auden argues that with this mass production, what was once popular art decays and becomes entertainment. That is, he says, it is consumed like food, forgotten, and then replaced. We no longer have popular art on the one hand and sophisticated art on the other. Instead, we now have money-making entertainment for the masses on the one hand and highbrow art for the cultural snobs on the other. The same story that Auden describes for the transformation of art in the modern age is what I would anticipate happening to even the noblest intellectual pursuits if the large language model was integrated into the process. There is no doubt that we would have to pay for these sophisticated outputs of the large language models. And while we might call them bespoke, what this really means is that they are created in order to be consumed in the moment, like food, forgotten, and then replaced when a slightly different need is had. Knowledge would doubtless become commercialized in the same way that popular art has. As art becomes entertainment, knowledge would become passing curiosities. Not sure if that's the best phrase for it. I'm open to suggestions there. What would knowledge become if it becomes consumed like this? Why do we read? The answer we gave above, to learn or for knowledge, has led us down this path, which leaves us with passing curiosities. What has gone wrong? Auden believes it has something to do with the impermanence of art. But how does one make art long-lasting? And this is where I sound like the Jeremiah that you described. Here, I think the program at St. John's College might offer some helpful answers. What we have done is taken a part of art, a part of the vast treasure troves, and what we think are the good parts. And we've created a life for these works in the lives of the individuals that study here. The works we have chosen are meant to last for our college. Plato's Republic, Euclid's Elements, Hobbes' Leviathan, Shakespeare's Henry IV. These are not the flavor of the day. They are here to stay. Auden, as we have seen, believes that sophisticated art might continue to exist despite the mass production of entertainment. But he calls this snobbery, if you'll remember. One might think that the college has not done anything special. What the college offers is precisely this: sophisticated art for the highbrow. Maybe the works we read are not appealing for the majority and cannot be accessed by the majority. Maybe our college exists on the fringe and is a club of exclusivity. I know better than to deny this unequivocally, and I'll also go so far as to acknowledge that the economic model of colleges relies upon a bit of this exclusivity. That said, calling what we do elitist doesn't make sense of my experience of enjoying this art and talking about it with students and colleagues. Yes, there are some snobs and snobbishness here, but for the most part, the students and my colleagues are refreshingly folk. This is a bit surprising. From the outside, our academic program might make us look like the snobbiest of snobs. From the outside, one might think that we are terribly high-minded and that we wouldn't countenance someone who had never read the classics. But, and correct me in the question period if you think I'm wrong, that just doesn't describe us. Here, I think, is the secret. In a college with majors, one could imagine that some courses of study would be considered highbrow and others lowbrow. Distinctions of rank are set up in the college or university by who studies what. But at St. John's, there are no such distinctions. We all study the same works of art. Inside our community, we appreciate the works on the program not as highbrow or as folk, but as ours. For the books, poems, musical scores, scientific papers, mathematical treatises on the program have become the ballads we sing collectively with friends, classmates, and colleagues over and over again. We choose these not to exclude or to appropriate them for a cultural elite. We choose them because, like a good drinking song, we love them. This isn't to say that the program won't occasionally change, but when a new work is chosen, it is never for the sake of entertainment, and it is never introduced as a passing flavor to be forgotten and replaced by a new dish. When a new book arrives, we commit to having it stick with us, usually for at least 3 to 4 years, before making any permanent changes. Our practice makes it clear we aren't simply sampling something, we are seeing if this new work could be a part of our permanent collection. What makes these works of art last is not simply what they are in themselves, the knowledge that we can glean from them, or the knowledge that we can glean from them. What makes these works long-lasting is the way in which a particular work forms the foundation for human relationships. Perhaps we read not simply to gain knowledge, but to read a particular author, to reach through time to that person. Perhaps we read a particular book because those around us are reading the very same book. Perhaps we read a particular book so that we can share with them a common understanding. Here it might help to realize that lasting art might look a lot like a religious text. The Torah is long-lasting, not simply because it is a great book, but because it is a book that creates communities. The first letter to Corinthians, Homer's Iliad, Euclid's Elements, Galileo's 2 chief world systems, Newton's Principia. Each of these books is long-lasting because they are the ground from which communities have grown. In Woolf's story, Pole's friends try to console her as she despairs the day she learned to read. Her friends, in trying to comfort her, shout out the names of Shakespeare, Milton, and Shelley. Pole responds by saying that they have been well educated, but that they aren't members of the London Library. The moment is soon gone. Pole seems to miss the key point. While her reading might seem pointless when faced with shelves of unutterably bad books, it would be treasured if she were to sit with her friends and read Milton aloud. Something that they all have in common, something that they all agree is good. As large language models become a prominent part of our world, I hope we aren't so overwhelmed with what they can or can't do, with the senseless sentences it fills the world with, that we lose sight of the good books our own community has committed to studying.